Details of security guarantees and efforts to arrange peace talks continue to evolve. This after US President Donald Trump hosted talks in Washington on Monday with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and several European leaders. On Tuesday, Trump ruled out the possibility of sending US troops to join any post-conflict European-led peacekeeping effort in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia has not committed to a bilateral leaders' summit with Ukraine, though reports suggest that President Putin did offer to host a possible one-on-one with President Zelenskyy. Dasha Chernyshova has more in this report.
The Kremlin says any deal on Ukraine should respect Russian security interests and the rights of Russians and Russian-speaking residents of Ukraine. Speaking on state media on Tuesday, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow never intended to take control of Ukrainian territory, but instead wanted to protect Russian speakers living in Donbas and Crimea. He said that Russia's goal was to protect the Russians who had lived on these lands for centuries. He also said that a bilateral meeting between the presidents of Russia and Ukraine or a trilateral summit with the US president were not ruled out. But Moscow says such summits should be well prepared. Lavrov added that Russia will always support a serious approach to negotiations and said that a step-by-step approach would lead to high-level meetings. On Monday, Vladimir Putin was briefed by Donald Trump on the results of his meetings in Washington, and the Kremlin said the two discussed the idea of a possible increase in the level of Moscow and Kyiv representation in their bilateral talks. On Tuesday, Russia handed over 1,000 bodies of fallen Ukrainian soldiers to Kyiv, while Russian media report the country received the bodies of 19 Russian servicemen in return. Dasha Chernyshova, CGTN, Moscow.
There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. William Lawrence is back with us. He's a political science and international affairs professor at American University. Vladimir Golstein heads the Slavic Studies department at Brown University. Also with us is Peter Zalmayev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. And Anton Fedyashin is a Russian and European affairs analyst and history professor at American University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Peter Zalmayev, we've been talking for some time right now. We've just had this flurry of meetings. It started in Alaska, then there were all those meetings that took place in Washington on Monday. Nothing's been nailed down. There are no agreements. Ukraine says that it's not going to consider territorial concessions. That's out of the question. President Trump called on President Zelenskyy to be more flexible, and now European leaders have dropped their calls for a ceasefire. So where does that leave Ukraine?
It leaves Ukraine in a very vulnerable spot. Of course, I consider, and I've said this on this program before, the talk of territorial land swaps or territorial concessions that Donald Trump so lightly, uses as a former real estate developer. You just swap some square footage for another, as if this is just some commercial property rather than territory of a sovereign state, right? This is a poison pill. This is a poison pill for Ukraine to swallow. Yes, it's being done ostensibly to protect Russian speakers. All of a sudden, we have this other argument, even though the original argument was to prevent NATO expansion, but that just shows you how inconsistent the Kremlin has been with its messaging. For Ukraine to consider swapping some of its territory for another bit of its own territory, that's at the outset a very unfair formula. But be that as it may, what Russia wants is the rest of the Donbas that Ukraine still controls. And that is some very important towns of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which have been turned into veritable fortresses since 2014, the start of the first hostilities there in that area. And if Russia assumes the control over these areas, it will assume control over commanding heights, from which, if it wants, it will have a much more advantageous position to continue occupying Ukrainian land. So this is what Ukrainians fear, that this will be, an exercise in winning time for Russia. And once again, in the absence of security guarantees, we have not been provided those. This is, once again, summing up, I will say, a very, very vulnerable position Ukraine finds itself in.
Anton Fedyashin, as I said, there have been all these meetings that took place, the one in Alaska, the summit between President Putin and President Trump. Then we had that series of meetings in Washington. Well, this is how the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, summed up yesterday what these meetings have meant to the delegates, the people who've been there.
So basically there were three outcomes of today. The first one was a good conversation on security guarantees. In other words, security guarantees by Europe and coordinated with the United States for Ukraine, and we start that work on concrete things immediately. The second one was a suggestion of a bilateral meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin, and that was what President Trump was testing with President Putin, and President Putin had agreed to do that meeting. And then the third step is after the bilateral meeting, if everything goes well, which is of course always a big if when you're dealing with Putin, there'll be a trilateral meeting.
So, Anton, I just want to get to that point where the Finnish president was talking about this possible bilateral meeting between President Putin and President Zelenskyy. The Kremlin has not confirmed anything yet. It's not ruled it out, but it hasn't confirmed anything yet. I mean, what are the chances of this meeting taking place? In fact, it went even a step further today because Politico, the political newspaper here in Washington, was reporting that it could take place in Budapest.
Right. Well, I can't answer for Politico or its sources, Anand, but I think a meeting is very likely, but there are conditions attached to that. And anyone who's bothered reading books about the history of diplomacy or any number of really great memoirs of diplomats, including, by the way, American secretaries of state. Dean Acheson comes to mind, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Baker, Cyrus Vance. I can rattle off these names for a long time, knows that questions as complicated as the ones that were discussed in the White House yesterday and then in Alaska a few days ago do not get settled by two presidents meeting for a photo op and some kind of performance. Every adult and everyone who's ever dealt with diplomacy understands that these questions have to be worked through by teams of diplomats. This usually takes the form of countries breaking down issues into sort of baskets, into areas, and then appointing teams to discuss them. One could be territory, another one could be refugees, a third one can be economic questions, a fourth one can be military issues, naval issues, and so on and so forth. Those teams prepare, they work through all of the problems, all of the disagreements. The most serious disagreements are left to the heads of ministries, then those get to the heads of state, and that's when the heads of state meet and they put their pen to paper and they clasp their hands. That's how it's always worked. So the idea that everyone's going to drop everything and rush either to Budapest or it could be Riyadh, it doesn't matter. It could be Istanbul, anywhere else. This isn't serious. This isn't diplomacy. So a meeting, I think, would be great for both sides, for everyone concerned and for Europe. But there's going to have to be some very serious work done. Donald Trump, by the way, doesn't understand this precisely for the reason that Peter mentioned earlier. He's a real estate person. He's not a diplomat. He thinks that deals can be made sort of on the fly, especially when you're as powerful as Donald Trump was in the New York real estate world. But that's not how these conversations, these negotiations will unfold.
William Lawrence, Anton there mentioned that there will have to be certain conditions met before these meetings take place. There's been a lot of talk about security guarantees, but we still don't know how that would work. I mean, President Trump initially mentioned the idea that there could possibly be U.S. troops in Ukraine. Then he walked that back earlier today, and then he said the United States could offer air support. But, you know, there's deep concerns among the Europeans. There's not a lot of optimism there. Let's listen to what the French President, Emmanuel Macron, had to say.
Personally, I have serious doubts about the reality of a desire for peace on the part of the Russian president. Because as long as he thinks he can win through war, he will do so. And his ultimate goal is to take as much territory as possible, to weaken Ukraine, and to have a Ukraine that is not viable on its own or within the Russian sphere of influence.
So, William, I mean, listening to President Macron there, I mean, the two sides seem to be far apart. If these conditions before a meeting have to be met, what needs to happen before?
Well, let me start by saying I strongly agree with everything Peter and Anton and President Macron said. But I would caveat by saying that Trump, with his superficial approach, which I agree with everything Anton said, wants to push something through that may be insufficient, wants to push something through that may be good enough for the moment. And I think that's what we're watching here. And if in negotiations, as everyone knows, sometimes you push something through for now and you deal with the thorny issues later. And so, you know, whatever conditions before the meeting are the conditions before the meeting, and conditions can be removed. There's sort of pre-negotiations going on. And then there's this strange spectacle of Trump learning on the job and his team learning on the job, because as everyone said, and I'll add, you know, not only Trump doesn't understand these issues, but Rubio doesn't understand them that well. Witkoff suffers from the same deficiencies that Trump does in terms of the real estate aspect. And so we're watching them learn on the job, and yet because they're willing to break taboos and force things, we have this spectacle which could lead to something. I could even imagine a scenario where we get something called a peace treaty that's actually just a ceasefire. Yeah. You know, and that's good because people stop dying, you know, for some period, and as long as no big concessions were made, that's okay. If I could address just quickly the security guarantees, it doesn't have to be NATO, and NATO country forces don't have to be called NATO country forces. And it gets back to what we were discussing yesterday and on Friday on this very program. What we're going to need is a robust deterrence for Russia not to invade again at the front line. Call it what you will. That's the security guarantee. It's the force. And don't forget, American troops, yeah, they may not be there, but they're in Germany. And they're there in Germany since the Cold War for that reason, to stop the Russians from trying to grab territory. And so the U.S. can mobilize pretty quickly, and you can put together sort of an umbrella of defense. What the Finnish president is doing and saying is wonderful here, but you can put together a defense of Ukraine that sort of superficially looks like, you know, it's not NATO and something palatable to Putin, but defends Ukraine. And if I could just one more issue, on the land swap issue, I agree entirely with what Peter said. But I would add that I think now the whole idea of swapping and concessions is a canard. And what we should really be talking about here is no territorial concessions and a frozen front line that you freeze in, like the Minsk agreement or whatever, you know, and you work from there. And I think that's what's going to happen. If we get any kind of deal here, they're going to push a lot of issues off to the future. And I'm glad that Trump's talking about the 20,000 or more kidnapped children as a high priority, because that's one of the many, many issues that'll have to be dealt with after whatever they're going for now is dealt with.
Vladimir Golstein, good to have you with us. It has been some time. Now, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, said after the Alaska meeting that the root causes of this conflict must be addressed. And the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, he expanded on that a little bit. Let's listen to what he had to say.
President Trump and his team, especially after the meeting in Alaska, took a much deeper approach to settling this crisis, realizing that it is necessary to eliminate the root causes. That's what we and President Putin have been saying all along. And one of these root causes is the issue of Russia's security, the fact that commitments given to us on preventing the expansion of NATO to the east have been consistently violated for decades. The president noted several times that after these promises were given, there were 5 waves of NATO expansion.
So, Vladimir Golstein, you know, both sides are saying that they have security concerns. There's also this question of NATO expansion. What happens? Is that taken off the table for Ukraine? Yet European members of NATO are insisting that, no, that should be still left on the table. If Ukraine wants to join NATO, then it should apply, and that should be approved.
Well, that will put us back in square one. I agree with the Russian leadership, which insists on removing the root causes. And, you know, this cold war talk and saber rattling, which we've heard even on this show, can continue but there is a reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is very clear. A, Russians have an upper hand in terms of the military. B, Trump definitely lost the interest in continuing this mindless exercise of bloodshed. He has other interests, be it, economic interests with Russia, dealing with China, and so many other things. So he's not interested in going on with this Cold War games, which many people in Washington and many people in Europe find fascinating. So Trump wants to move ahead, and Putin also wants to move ahead. He wants to sort of, he hoped, and that Trump sent him signals that NATO is of kind of consideration for Ukraine. The NATO wouldn't push closer and closer because that's what brought Russia into the conflict with Ukraine to begin with. So Putin is willing to sit down and talk, and from what we understand, he is willing to actually stop rather successful military campaign, because Russia is very close to Kharkiv, very close to sort of other areas. They're not that far from Odessa, so they are willing to stop, provided they have guarantees, and these guarantees refer to not NATO expansion, to Ukraine becoming a regular, normal neighbor rather than a Russophobic instrument which West keeps on using for reasons which elude me, and also the right of Russian-speaking, Russian-cultured people of the eastern Ukraine. That's why Russians went there to begin with, to protect these people who've been bombarded, mistreated, treated as second-rate people since 2014. So these are the root causes. If Zelenskyy is serious, he should sit down and negotiate and compromise. If he is not serious, he can let the likes of Finnish, president say something like, we want to repeat what happened in 1944 with Germany. Well, Germany got defeated eventually. If he wants to echo the fate of Germany and continues on this escalation course, they're going to get it. Because from what I've seen, and I've seen it with my own eyes, traveling through Russia, Russia actually didn't really start fighting seriously. If there is NATO forces, French, English, German, or whatever in Ukraine, then we're going to get a serious war on our hands. Who wants it? So I think this what a real canard is this Cold War talk that Russia is expecting.
Let me get
look at the map. Russia was in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe. Russia was in Eastern Germany. They moved.
All right, Vladimir. I want to get to Peter. I want to get to Peter Zalmayev. Peter Zalmayev, on this question of the fate and future of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians who live in the eastern part of the country, there was something else that came from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He said that Moscow never talked about the need to seize territories. The goal, Lavrov said, was to protect Russian people who live in these lands for centuries. I mean, in there could be a compromise, the demand for land concessions could be something else. It could be guarantees for the safety of Russian people there. Do you see this as some kind of compromise that could work if there's some guarantees that those people who live there will be allowed to speak the Russian language, will be allowed to continue their own affairs?
I mean, it could, but once again, I think this is a red herring. We're not really talking about the rights of the Russian speakers. The Russian side has cleverly actually used this, issue along with the issue of the supposed persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church, because it plays well with some American Christian conservatives, including part of the Trump's mega base, right? And that was an issue that prominently featured in the interview of Tucker Carlson with Vladimir Putin, if you remember. I think it's a red herring. You are looking at the Russian speaker from the east of Ukraine. I grew up in the town of Donetsk, as you may know, and I grew up Russian-speaking, etc. The Russian speakers of Ukraine never really needed that sort of protection, over which they would be willing to fight, spill blood. And even now, I mean, you walk the streets of Kiev, and probably half of the people you will meet still speak Russian. They're not being persecuted for that. So once again, this is window dressing. This is also a play for sympathy. This is a way to drag out the time. for the Russian administration, not to anger Donald Trump into doing something that Russians don't want him to, giving Ukraine more weapons, etc.
Yeah.
But this is not the real goal. Once again, the real goal remains political control of Kiev.
Yeah, Peter, do you also get the sense that there is a failure to appreciate here in Washington that this is not an issue, a conflict that can be resolved very quickly? It's very complex. There are lots of issues to be discussed.
I think Anton really laid it out quite eloquently. This is very slapdash. I mean, looking at the end of the Alaska summit, and the American delegation left some sensitive documents behind, laying out, lunch plans and who ate what, and this was pretty galling. And you look at Mr. Witkoff, who is Donald Trump's special envoy to Ukraine. Well, he's doing it apparently part-time as he flies between Washington and Tel Aviv. He also is involved in the Middle East conflict, etc. Folks, this is not serious. And once again, I believe Donald Trump is being a bit too hasty. Once again, he's being impulsive. He's guided by this obsession of his to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And so what we're left with is, having to play catch up to America's president's whims, which really do not match the gravity and the seriousness and the complexity of this problem.
Yeah. Anton, given that this is a very complex issue that will take some time to resolve, I mean, there must be concerns on both sides that the longer this goes on, the more people are going to die, there's going to be more destruction as well. I mean, how long can both these sides sustain this?
Well, the Russians can sustain it for longer, especially given that they have the upper hand militarily, and demographically, of course, they dwarf Ukraine, which had a smaller population back in 2014, and that's shrunk even further. The Russian economic potential is, for all of the problems that the sanctions have created, is also the military technological potential is greater than what the West has been able to muster up to now, which is why there aren't enough weapons for the money to buy. Going back to what Peter mentioned, I agree with him about the slapdash business with Trump and Witkoff, but unfortunately those slapdash expectations also extend to Vladimir Zelenskyy, who has now changed his tune and his position 180 degrees. He used to not want to meet Putin, but now he wants to meet Putin. But the Europeans are the same way. They also are now waiting impatiently for a tete-a-tete between Putin and Zelenskyy, and again, this has to be prepared. Trump's gunning for a Nobel Peace Prize. By the way, this year marks the 120th anniversary that Teddy Roosevelt brought the Japanese and the Russians together in August of 1905 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War. So Trump seems to be trying to fit Roosevelt's shoes. And if I may, Anna, just very quickly, one last thing about the security guarantees. We're going to hear no end about this for the next 48 hours until there's a new story that dominates the news cycle. But listen, let me remind all of our viewers that Ukraine already has 25 bilateral security agreements with NATO nations and beyond, by the way. All the G7s have signed security agreements, including the United States. I'll even give you the date when Joe Biden and President Zelenskyy signed that agreement. It was on the 13th of June, 2024. And there were a lot of breathless articles about how this is going to change everything and nothing will be the same. And so we're talking again about security guarantees that we've already talked about in a whole cycle. And those weren't worth the paper they were signed on. And I'm afraid that there's not much that the Europeans or even the Americans that are going to be able to deliver.
Okay, William Lawrence, I've just got a few minutes left. I want to get to you, and I'm going to get to Vladimir Golstein as well. But William Lawrence, let me ask you first. President Trump has staked a good part of this second term on him resolving this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So politically, what's at stake for him?
Quite a bit. I mean, because he's so invested in it. Obviously, Americans don't generally vote on foreign policy. They both in the midterm elections and in presidential elections, they vote on domestic issues unless there's a foreign policy disaster that happened. But there's lots of political calculations going on. Let me add something I think I've said before, but it bears repeating here. The Nobel Committee is not going to give a Nobel Prize to a Western leader that forces a European country to give up territory. Not going to happen, particularly if it puts the Swedes, on the back foot, having to join NATO. But getting to the politics of this all, an interesting thing that was sort of more in the press a month ago than it is now, but it's very important, is that the right in the United States is losing faith in Trump's ability to even get a deal, to even make peace here, and so there's a lot of churning on the right of dissatisfaction.
I've got just a minute left. I want to get to Vladimir Golstein. Vladimir Golstein, would it be fair to say that Russia is looking beyond just a settlement of this conflict, that it's looking at basically reworking the architecture of European security, the one that was put in place after the end of the Cold War?
Yeah, Russia is looking into the 21st century, and they want to leave the Cold War behind, and they want to live in multifocal, multipolar world where interests of every country is taken seriously, and they're willing to work with it. And on that note, I also want to add that Putin recognizes that no matter what we say about Trump, that Trump, despite all his numerous faults, actually has a certain vision. He wants to take United States further. He doesn't want to waste money on some kind of wars with other people organizes. He wants to negotiate and make deals with China, with India, with Russia. And I think Putin is on the same way with it. Let's leave it behind. Let's find a compromise. And compromise is meaning every party has something to lose. And I think that's where we are now. And unless people dig their heels and don't want to budge an inch, the war will continue and bloodshed will continue, no matter what beautiful words every political leader says.
Yeah, okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.